Did Christopher Columbus suck, or did the past just suck? Join us today as we reconsider his status as one of the prime evils of the New World, because cannibalism was already a local custom before the Italians brought the perfect wine to pair it with. That's right, some of those locals may have actually even appreciated those vessels of hatred coming into their lives. Welcome to Deep Thoughts While Gaming. I'm Chris Chappell. Since today is Columbus Day, or as the more woke among us call it, Indigenous Peoples Day, I thought it'd be fitting to do some comparative literature. Comparative gaming. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but this is not the story of Christopher Columbus. It is, in fact, actually gameplay footage from the just-released Diablo IV first expansion, Vessel of Hatred. You can play as one of 6 battle-hardened explorers as they brave the new mysterious jungle regions of Nahantu. A game that expands on the story you've come to love, with physically fighting the devil always being a good sign that you're on the right side. Fortunately, real life isn't so simple. Taking a snapshot of any moment during your run will probably have you looking more like a maniac than a guy who's just trying to spread the good word, and possibly bring a bit of loot back home with him. Traveling to new regions ain't cheap, you know. As could possibly be the case with dear old Christopher Columbus, a man who used to stand tall as a great explorer, decked out in the top-tier loot from the royal treasuries of King Ferdinand II, with him now being viewed as more of a monster, snapshots becoming more real than the full story in the eyes of the general public. Murderer of men, destroyer of worlds, degenerate and alcoholic of the brave new world. At least if you listen to your teachers and the sliver of source material this perspective has. As only a few years ago, the prevailing narrative became that Christopher Columbus wasn't even worthy of a statue, much less a whole holiday, and schools across the nation turned their backs on a former icon. With this becoming what Christopher Columbus's voyages became known for, slaying locals on their own turf and stealing their loot, dressed to impress in fine Italian linens all the while, completely invalidating the memories I have of painting the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria as a lad in elementary school. However, did Christopher Columbus really pick the barbarian class as the start of his playthrough? Did he really use his own body as a meat grinder against a foreign and peaceful people? Or is it possible that, just like in Diablo IV and its representation of the battle between good and evil, the story, bloody and beautiful though it may be, is potentially a little exaggerated? Which, when it comes to Diablo IV, is generally what the players are looking for, with thousands of enemies exploding on screen as you enjoy the sound of their dying laments. This is the experience the people crave from this franchise. The leveling system has changed, the max level being cut in half before 10 levels are added, and a whole new class, the Spiritborn, has been added, making sure there will be a lot more blood to spill if you're coming back for this expansion, with reviews overall being good if the story is a bit lacking. Which I guess doesn't really matter when sensationalism is what you're looking for, and sensationalism is what the people crave. Consider the expansion released in 1980 to Columbus's own story, written by lead developer Howard Zinn in A People's History of the United States. In just 9 pages, Zinn rewrites the entire perspective on Columbus, making it just as brutal and bloody as Diablo IV. Zinn was one of the first people to write an anti-colonialist perspective of Christopher Columbus that would eventually bear fruit in identity politics, in the form of many of the talking points you know and love today. But it turns out this thinly veiled Marxist gruel actually isn't that well researched, because it turns out Zinn's 9 pages can't really compare to anthropologist and author Carol Delaney's 5 years of researching Columbus for her book Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. She paints a more complete picture of who this man actually was, and why, in her opinion, the notion that he was even a bad man, much less one of the worst, is completely wrong. According to her research, Columbus did not ever own slaves, that he was a devoutly religious man who acted as such, and that even in considering that 23 local slaves were sent back to Italy under his command, these men would have been imprisoned by today's standards, having been part of some of the more cannibalistic and warlike groups on the island, which threatened the indigenous Taino and Arawak people that Columbus had befriended. Christopher Columbus went so far as to make the son of one of the chiefs his godson, and learned the natives' language himself. But stalwart defenders of those 9 pages will say it sounds too good to be true and that Christopher Columbus can't just be a more multifaceted individual than previously thought, and the battle of good versus evil can't be more subtle than Diablo IV makes it. Americans like to see things in terms of black and white, good and evil, potato or potato, perhaps finding it uncomfortable that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and this is really called a potato. Take, for example, the destruction of the Incan, Mayan, and Aztecs at the hands of the conquistadors. Similar thing to Columbus, some will say they were totally evil, destroying peaceful indigenous people for their evil, toxic Christian beliefs, much like many of the peace-loving entities on Nahantu, who really just suffer from being misunderstood. But those groups were committing real-deal, horrifying acts of slavery, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. Loving thy neighbor in these communities was definitely a foreign European concept, unless you're talking about loving your neighbor with a side of mash, but that also doesn't mean the conquistadors were the good guys. The problem with simplifying narratives is that through the omission of key information and the emotional focus on others, the story itself takes on a kind of falseness that when repeated over time becomes understood as the full truth. The 1619 Project, for example, serves as another great example of someone pushing false, simplistic narratives. 1619 is supposed to be the day the first slave ship came to America, and this should be the day that America was really founded, built on slavery and oppression after all. Except, those on board weren't actually slaves, they were indentured servants. Also a very horrible thing, except that white people were also indentured servants, creating a slightly more complicated picture in relation to our founding story. In fact, the first person ever to own actual African slaves, Anthony Johnson, was an African former indentured servant himself, who also happened to have gone to court to defend his right to own slaves, with even some Native American tribes having a grand old time with slaves even after slavery was abolished post-Civil War. All of this making history seem oh so complicated. Not the simple narrative some are selling to get you to give them money, buy their books, hire them to give speeches on why you specifically are the problem, and push for things like reparations. In relation to which economist Thomas Sowell says, if you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races, nor one set of perpetrators, with even Delaney admitting that future explorers following Columbus did not treat the locals with the same amount of respect as he did. However, that doesn't mean that he should be thrown into the same bucket, as, aside from the roughly 12 quotes from secondhand sources that critics of Columbus provide, you could just read his actual journal, easy to find for free online, and make your own opinion. Because sometimes the necromancer and the barbarian really are the heroes after all. Thank you for watching Deep Thoughts While Gaming. And remember, there are more slaves now than at any point in history. So now's your chance to get ahead of the reparations game. Sadly, Deep Thoughts While Gaming isn't funded by forced wealth redistribution schemes, so I'm forced to ask you to voluntarily give me money on patreon.com/gamersunbeaten, or hit that join button to become a channel member, where I have to give you things to incentivize you, rather than just relying on the government to tax it out of you. You'll get exclusive emojis, live streams, a Discord server, and a history written by the winners. And if you'd like to be a useful idiot, check out this video about Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, and why the indigenous Na'vi are dirty Reds.